Well, hello and welcome. For those who've not been to a virtual cafe site before, or not been to any cafe site before, the standard cafe site format, at least the way we do it, is to have a short talk from our invited speaker. Sometimes we've had a panel, but more usually one individual speaker who will talk for around 20 minutes or so. And that's then followed by an extended question and answer session, which is your opportunity to ask to ask the speaker as many questions as you want. And so in effect, it reverses the usual power relationship effectively between the expert and the rest of the population, the community. You as the audience participants have far more control effectively over how the evening goes and what you'll be interested in than you would with a more conventional kind of public engagement with science lecture at a university or a lecture hall, where you'll tend to get a 3/4 of an hour standard lecture from the speaker and then 10 minutes at best for questions. So it's part of the democratization of science, I suppose. Which is another subject in its own right we could talk about another time, because there actually has been a certain amount of research done on the extent to which the cafe side has been part of the reintroduction of democracy into Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain. So for now, that's surely plenty enough to get us started. A 20-minute talk from our invited speaker. Now, most of us perhaps will know about tree ring dating as a way of understanding the past and the environments of in history and prehistory. But our speaker tonight is going to be talking about how we can use the whole tree to understand something not just of the past, but also of what it means to us in the present. Tim Kellett, I will pass over to you now, and you can describe yourself and your work in your own good way.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all here. I'm the chairman of Cornwall Ancient Tree Forum, so that's a voluntary role, and I also work as a lead verifier for the Woodland Trust, verifying trees on the ancient tree inventory. So I don't have an environmental specifically or ecological background or historic background. I'm an architect and urban designer by profession, and done lots of building conservation work. But my real love are ancient trees. As some of you will know, I've spent many hours and days over the last 8 to 10 years recording trees, learning about them and teaching about them all over. So I'm going to give you an introduction to ancient trees and what's special about them, what makes them interesting, what makes them valuable. And I'll try to show examples just from Cornwall, so you can get a flavour of our local tree population. So I'm going to do this with slides, so I'm going to be in the background talking while I show slides for you. And you can ask any questions, and I've got some more images and things if subjects come up. So I'm just going to do this share screen now to start off. Okay. Is that working okay? Can you see an ancient tree?
That's working fine, Tim.
Brilliant, brilliant. So this happened to be one of the latter ancient trees I've recorded, and it's near a place called Llewellyn in Cornwall. And at the top is the link to our email link if ever you want to email any questions or find out about activities that we're doing. The big question that everybody asks me when I start talking or mentioning ancient trees is, what exactly is an ancient tree? How do you find it? Everybody says they know what it is, but they want to know actually how they're defined. And sorry, there you go. Nice and simple in this definition. Ancient trees will be the oldest of their species, and different species live to different ages. But they will also be culturally, possibly, and biologically, definitely important. So we'll find out why. If we look at this image here, it's an image of the growth of an oak tree. Let's take one species over its lifetime. And look at that incredible length of time, the potential lifetime as an oak actually is. Oaks don't always live that long, we know that. Lots of them will die before they get to 800. Some oaks will even go further. I know there are oaks that are 1,000 and maybe 1,200 years old in this country. And that is absolutely immense. When we're talking about an ancient oak, we're talking about a tree that is about 400 years old. So that's right in the middle of that image there. You can also see how that tree changes shape and character over that length of time. From a tall, healthy, big canopied oak tree standing proud in the middle of the field, it then starts to get short and squat and develops holes and hollows and dead branches. This is precisely normal. It's part of the life of the tree. It's part of the life of all ancient trees. And a tree that is retrenched, which is what we call this growing downwards, this losing of its canopy, it can still stay around for 500, 600, 700 years, which is absolutely incredible. So when you see a tree that's looking like this, do not think it's on its last leg. It's definitely not. So here we go. This is a tree that's in Lanhydrock. And there are two trees here. On the left, in the distance, is a much younger tree. We might call that a veteran tree. In the centre is definitely an ancient tree. And it's got those characteristics of being very fat and having a hollow trunk and having lots of bumps and knocks and crannies and deadwood in the tree. Sometimes a younger tree might have some of the features, and that then we might call it a veteran, but it doesn't have the great age. It's not the oldest of its species. And that tree there is probably a pollard in the parkland in Lanhydrock. But trees come in all kinds of locations. So just look at that monster there. That is all one tree. That's actually about a mile away from the last one. And it's in a hedge. And it's an ash tree. And it has a multitude of stems growing from it. And over the hundreds of years that that's grown, it's spread and spread. So it's completely taken over that hedge at the base. It's about 13 meters in circumference, and quite definitely an ancient, full of hollows and fungi, all sorts of species living on. But more and more types and shapes and sizes of ancient trees. These three trees standing together in the field are actually one tree. Would you believe it? That is also an ash. That tree has hollowed out in its centre, and then it's started to decay even more until it's fragmented into three pieces. Of course, all of those three are linked together under the ground by the root system. This is definitely an ancient ash tree. It's also a tree that's been pollarded. It's been cut off about 2 meters above the ground regularly through its life. And every time it is cut at the top, it sprouts new branches and new growth. And you can see how young the branches look at the top. But what's interesting is each one of those units of the tree seem to work independently. So you can actually separate that bark area into different, what we call functional units. And each section of the trunk is connected to a corresponding section of the roots, which are in turn connected to a corresponding section of the canopy above it. This is another monster tree, incredibly wide at the base, and that's the River Foy just behind. And this tree, you can see, it's a veritable garden of delights. It's got all kinds of mosses, lichens, epiphytes, those are plants that grow on the tree. Underneath them, it's got thousands of invertebrates and fungi growing in the hollows of the tree. It is a truly ancient tree in an area that once was wood pasture, but underneath it, it was actually an ancient medieval tin streaming area. So that whole environment around there was environmentally devastated as tin streaming, completely bare. But after that had stopped, it took over as wood pasture, and this 400-year-old tree has had time to grow on top of it. So ancient trees, we talked about being the oldest of the species, but veteran trees have all the characteristic features of decay. Hollowing trunk, dead or decaying branches that have substantial volume, and these characteristics are irreplaceable. They're creating habitats that are irreplaceable. What we mean by irreplaceable, you can't cut down a veteran tree and replace it with 1,000 new trees planted in the same area or a different area, because it takes hundreds of years to get these characteristics to form this kind of habitat. Veteran trees are an important definition in planning and development now. Have a little bit more protection. So what goes on in these trees? What lives in them? You can see from this image there's a whole host of animals and plants and fungi that live in these habitats. In the centre there is a diagram of a typical ancient tree showing all of these little nooks and crannies, barks, fissures, hollows, branches, leaves, fungi, and so each one of those provides a different habitat, something specific to live in. And you can see a range of insects and animals there. Tree creeper, the dormouse, the barn owl, the bat, the crane fly, the red squirrel. There are 3 big beetles there on the left. The brilliant green one is the noble chafer. In the bottom, the black one is the lesser stag beetle. And on the right, the red one is the cardinal click beetle. But there are also hornets. There's millions and millions of different species that begin to live in these trees when they get to this great age. And that's why these are so precious, much more precious than a new woodland created alongside. The fungi that grow on the trees are, fungi is incidentally a separate kingdom. So like animals and plants, fungi have a kingdom all of their own. And these fungi colonize the tree. They don't infect the tree. There's very few fungi that actually will kill a living tree. There are more and more that colonize it and live alongside the tree. And what they're very good at doing is recycling the wood from the tree as it dies. So the central part of the tree, the heartwood, is often dead wood. It's dysfunctional, not being used by the tree. It's the outer part, the outer rings, the sapwood, that transport the nutrients and the water up the tree. So then these fungi can come in and they will colonize the dead wood. The chicken of the woods and the beefsteak fungus you can see here actually begin to recycle the cellulose in the wood, and they leave the wood looking hard and brittle. This is called brown rot. But other fungi, like the southern bracket here, go in and start to recycle the lignin in the wood, and they leave it looking white and soft and stringy. So cellulose and lignin go together to combine to make wood, and different fungi will start to absorb and recycle different parts of it. Once that's done, the next army of invertebrates will come into the tree and start to eat softened wood, and they will then create their homes in tunnels for their eggs and their larvae. And there are thousands of very specialists invertebrates like these beetles that live purely on the dead wood in trees. These are called saprophilic insects. And then the inner part of the tree is broken down even more by the insects to eventually form hollows in the tree. This is the process of hollowing. It starts with the fungi, then the insects, and you get a wood mold in the base of the tree when it's all crumbled down. We're looking inside here, an ash, a hollow ash tree. Look, you notice that thing, structure in the middle? That's a root. And that root is actually part of the ash tree itself. And it's grown down into the wood mold at the bottom. It's beginning to recycle that wood mold. It's recycling itself. It's eating itself. It's completely amazing. And we call these roots aerial roots. And you'll often see them growing on the inside of hollow trees. Nothing's wasted in nature. So looking at roots of the tree, really quite important how big they are, how far they spread. And we need to know a lot about this when we're looking at potential damage from farming and planning and so on. In that image, the roots of the tree spread right over to the left-hand side where the arrow's pointing. They know this because this field had never been ploughed before. It was ploughed once in its known recorded life, and they found roots that far away from it. And that is immense, and that would be spreading out on all sides. Now, we talked about fungi, but there are other types of fungi that live under the ground with the roots of the tree, and these are called mycorrhizal fungi. And all of that stringy substance in the sort of lower 75% of that image are actually fungi. They're the mycelium of mycorrhizal fungi. And what they do is they intertwine with the roots, and they start acting as if they're roots, and they start absorbing water and nutrients from the soil and pass them to the roots of the tree, and then they're taken up the tree. It's a two-way process, because then the tree gives something back to the mycelium and to the fungi, and it gives back sugars. So sugars that are created in the tree, up in the leaves through photosynthesis, are then passed down the tree into the roots and given back to the fungus. So it's got a symbiotic relationship. One works with the other. One actually can't work without the other. Without these fungi, the tree is not very healthy. When the fruiting bodies pop up, this is what they look like. The sap, the porcini mushrooms, a fruiting body of fungi, as is the fly agaric, the typical fungus with the white spots on. So they're mycorrhizal. They have this really close relationship with trees. Oliver Rackham, if you've ever heard of Oliver, he died a few years ago, said a single 400-year-old oak tree can generate a whole ecosystem of creatures for which 10,000 200-year-old oaks are no use at all. Now, that seems totally far-fetched, but what he's actually saying is a 200-year-old oak tree hasn't been around enough to develop this fantastic ecosystem. But when a tree gets to become ancient, it certainly has. And ancient trees have far more value than thousands and thousands of younger trees in terms of biodiversity. So where do we find them? Where do we find these ancient trees? We spend ages searching them out by walking around. But we can do a bit of research in the background, and looking at maps is one way of doing it. The Ordnance Survey on the bottom has the name of the tree, Burns Oak. the 1870s, 80s Ordnance Survey above also has fern zone by the side of the River Inny, which is a tributary of the Tamar. When a tree has been around for a really long time and has become quite famous, his name sticks. And sometimes, if it's been a very, very long time, very old tree, it's actually mapped. And that's one way that we find them. And this is, in fact, Fern's Oak, because we've actually discovered this and recorded it. And it's an odd-looking creature, don't you think? There's a great lump of tree on the right-hand side, which is a huge stem that has collapsed. And the stem on the left-hand side of the tree, which is actually still alive, has propped up with a very old oak prop. We came across a photograph of the same tree, probably, I think this was in the 70s, and it shows you how that lump on the right was once attached. And you can begin to get a sense of the possible size of that tree when it was a complete pollard. It has got the fat base that it would have had, and then smaller stems leading up from that, which are indicating that was a pollard of immense age because it is so big. If we look at aerial photographs, this is one near Llewellyn I came across just doing a casual search on Google, and I recognised this immediately as an unusual landscape because there are no field boundaries in the central area, and there are lots of open grown trees, just individual trees there. And that immediately tells me that this is very early parkland or wood pasture or something of that nature. So when we took that area and looked at the historic map, yes, here it is, it's confirmed. So that sort of shaded area, the very light grey shading, is indicating parkland environment, and it's called Trelast, and the house is up here, the original house. So that was interesting because parklands and wood pastures are definitely a place where there were very old trees. Also, as I said, they do record trees very, very accurately at that time. And these tree symbols are placed in exactly the right position to show where trees really were recorded because they were very valuable. So if we look at that arrow there and then flick onto an aerial photograph, the same tree appears in the same place in both. So this is actually the tree. And we went on to this site and recorded lots of these trees. This is part of our group. And this is a 6 metre girth ancient oak tree, which is one of the ones in our records. When we get these records, this is a bit of citizen science, by the way. When we get these records, we put them on this ancient tree inventory. So it's a website. Anybody can do it. You've got an old tree in your back garden, you can record it and put it on here. We record ancient, veteran, and others notables. So they aren't so as old, but they might have some local significance. This is a sort of a map on the ancient tree inventory, which shows where each of these. So it's a GIS basis, geographical. Each one of these symbols you can click on then to reveal more and more information, which we've recorded. Here's one that says sweet chestnut. Girth 7 meters, details about how much dead wood is in the tree, and lots more details underneath. These are some photographs of it, they're also on the site. And this one was the first ancient tree I ever recorded in a place called Point, not far from Falmouth. We measure the tree because that is giving us an indication of the age. Because trees grow tree rings, that you can see in the picture on the right, one every year, more or less, we can get a sense of how many years a tree of certain species on certain ground conditions has grown. So that initial measurement is quite important. We need a bit more information than that. It's not so straightforward, but we do have a lot of data sets and produce graphs and indicators of the likely age of certain species in different ground conditions. So oaks here, let's say 600 years old. If it is growing in the pink on foreground, that might be about 6 meters in girth, so a 6 meter girth there. If it's growing in an average site, it might be about 7 meters. If it's growing on a champion site, a really, really good site with very, very big trees, it might be even nearer 9 meters. So for a 600-year-old tree, the size of it varies depending on the ground and the conditions of the tree, and we need to be very much aware of those. Big trees like 9 meters are quite rare. These are quite old. These are trees that are about 850 years old, possibly. This researcher from Kew Gardens, Olios Farjon, found this amazing fact out. In England, there are recorded 115 living ancient oaks over 9 meters in girth. And in the rest of Europe, only 98 recorded. Wait, is that right? It's absolutely right. The rest of Europe, including Scotland and Wales, there are less trees of this size. What is going on here? I'd be interested if anybody's got any theories out. Why are there so many ancient trees of this size and this age in this country? The data also gives us insights into landscapes. This is the Foy landscape, where there are massive clusters all sitting on top of each other of ancient and veteran trees, really dense in the area. But they correspond to some interesting facts in this Henry VIII's plan of the Foy. And some of these are interesting palisaded areas. These are actually deer parks, which were fenced. This one at the top is Restormal. This one a bit lower down is Baconic. And Restormal was the largest deer park in Cornwall. And so the mapping is showing us there's something very special about this landscape in the Foy Valley, which will lead on to conservation projects. And this is Baconic, an incredible landscape, a wood pasture. So it's open, it's grassed, it's got animals in it pasturing. The trees grow to their fullest size because they can spread really wide with very, very large limbs. And this kind of environment is the one that lets the tree grow the oldest it possibly can do. And is the one where you find more ancient trees than anywhere else, the parkland wood pasture, a bit like the forests, Epping Forest, the Forest of Dean, Windsor Forest, and so on, where the land is being protected. And did you know, interesting fact here, that Cornwall was once a royal forest, just like Windsor, or the Forest of Dean, or Epping, or any of the other great forests. And if you want to know more, I'll tell you more afterwards on that one. 9 meter trees, we don't have any in Cornwall, I'm sorry to say, but this would have been one. This is the oldest tree in Cornwall, the Darley Oak. And it would have been 9 meters if both halves of the tree were still standing. But in the 80s, in a storm, half of the tree did actually come crashing down. We believe it is about 900 years old, give or take. It could be pushed to 1,000, but I'm being a bit conservative on that. And we have quite a bit of data historically about the dimensions of the tree. Here you can see the other side where half of it has fallen away. That's the inner hollow of the tree. And look at the way the bark is completely healing and starting to grow on the inside. Fantastic tree, this one. It's in a front garden of a farmhouse, Darley Farm, on the edge of Bodmin Moor. And it's one designated as one of the 50 great trees, great British trees for the Queen's Golden Jubilee in 2002. And it's still healthy, and it's still occasionally getting acorns, which you can see on the right side. And at that point, I'll stop sharing. Hi, everybody. It's from one of the acorns, believe it or not. I collected a lot of acorns, and I've been here, the oldest tree in Cornwall. I'm now giving away to conservation projects around Cornwall. So if anybody's got any places where they think they're deserving of a tree that could be properly looked after and have lots of land and light to grow in, well, just contact me. Thanks.
Wow.
Back to you, Robin.
So in effect, you're suggesting people should foster a tree.
You could, yes, but you've got to prove to me. You've got to prove to me first that you've got the right place for it, and that you can look after it. It's not a tree to put in your back garden, unless you've got a ginormous back garden.
That seems absolutely fair enough to me. Right, folks. Tim, that was really, that was full of bits we might want to tease out. I noticed that one or two people have already made some comments. Let me first explain, for those who've not done this before, as you move your mouse, you will find, usually I think at the bottom of the screen, a number of controls pop up, including one of them which says chat. It's got a little number 2, because there's 2 comments in there at the moment. If you want to make a comment, or particularly if you want to ask a question, that's where you go. So if you click on that, it will open up a screen on the side of your main screen, and that's where you can find what other people have said or what other questions they've asked. And this is where we get the question and answer session. That said, if anybody is particularly keen to actually come on and ask your question in person, the technology does allow us to do that. And David here, our secretary, will be scanning the crowd. If you're interested in actually coming on and asking, as I say, in person, put up your hand and we'll spot you. There's actually a way that you can do that electronically. It's called a reaction, and at the one on the far right of the controls, there is the place where you can actually electronically put a hand on the screen, and that way we'll know that you're wanting to come on screen. But otherwise, my job is to just keep an eye on what's happening in the chat room and make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask. The last of the service announcements is to remind those who weren't aware or have joined us after we've said this, that we record all of these talks. The recording will in a few days' time appear on YouTube on our own channel, which is our library effectively of recordings. So if there was something particularly interesting and you wanted to tell a friend about it who had missed it, they can always log in and watch and listen again another time, as can we all. Because it's recorded, that means that if you yourself don't want to appear, if you don't want your wife or husband or probation officer or whatever to know what you were doing, then you can actually, not only can you not come on screen, but you can even, you could ask us to edit out any comment that we've made, which we can easily do. But you can also disguise your identity by changing your name. I think we'll leave it as if anybody's interested in doing that, rather than taking any more time to explain that. But you can give yourself whatever nom de plume or nom de zoom, I suppose, you wish. So that said, enough from that. Let's get straight into the questions. So we have Loveday mentioning that the tree that you said is no longer 9 meters, was 11 before it fell. Do you want to make a comment on that?
I just will say that I was taking the data from a book by Edgar Thurston, who wrote a book in the 1930s about the flora of Cornwall, trees and flora of Cornwall. And the measurement that he took at that time, I sort of did a conversion of that, which was about 8.5 meters or something like that in the 1930s. And there is a reference to a larger measurement, but I'm almost certain that that was just taken around the base of the tree, where the tree flares out at the base, and it's not a comparative measurement to where we would measure now. So on our ancient tree inventory, if we can get a measurement at 1.5 meters height, that is a standard that we adopt. So I'm making that comparison. So I would say the tree was probably about 8 point whatever at that time in the 30s, and would have grown to something like 9 meters now. So that's why I'm adjusting my age slightly from definitely over 1,000 to probably just below 1,000 at the moment. But don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. Everybody says it's a 1,000-year-old tree.
But so next time you hear that, read the small print.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just take us through more or less in sequence as the questions are coming.
Okay.
Henry asks, should we be pollarding older trees to ensure that there continue to be ancient trees? Are people already doing that? But is that right that pollarding will actually help enhance the age of the tree? Is that the relationship between pollarding and age?
Yes, pollarding was done to produce timber of different sizes for use by people, or for providing fodder for animals. So depending when you cut the tree, how thick the stems were, they had different uses. But what people found was that pollarding the tree does actually prolong its life significantly. And because it's managed, there are no huge branches to break off the tree. And also the tree grows very, very slowly over a long period of time. All of the great forests and deer parks in the southeast, for instance, or central England, a lot of those trees are actually pollarded. But they didn't do it to prolong the life of the tree. They did it because pollarding was a good way of producing timber and fodder that is out of reach of the sheep or the deer or the cattle. And that's why all pollarding happens at about 6 foot 2 meters height. It's precisely to keep the new shoots out of the way. Now, in Cornwall, it was not a very well practiced thing. There are not many examples of pollarded trees. I know where they are, and I've seen quite a few, but nothing as much as the southeast. But pollarding is absolutely brilliant, and it will enable the tree to live quite a long time, but you have to keep pollarding. So if you're going to be around about 600 years, then I think that's a great thing to do, or it's something you've got to pass on to future generations.
Yeah, that's quite a legacy. So the other half of Henry's question is, are people already deliberately pollarding in order to produce the next generation of ancient trees? Is there a movement that does that?
There is definitely pollarding trees. One of the things it does do is start the hollowing process quite early. So it's producing veteran characteristics much earlier in its life. Now that might seem contrary to long life, but hollowing doesn't mean a tree is going to die. So pollarding will bring on veteran characteristics, homes for fungi and inverts fairly quickly in its process. And I noticed that Trelisic, they started to introduce the practice of pollarding. I guess it's more of an experiment in tree husbandry or whatever, not for any big commercial reasons, but people are definitely doing that. Big problem with pollard trees, of course, is when you forget to do it, so forget, when you stop pollarding for hundreds of trees, those branches on the top grow really, really big. And then they can get so heavy, they will fall apart and split the tree in half. So if you don't manage a pollard tree for a long time, it could bring about the demise of the tree very soon. So we have to be aware of that.
And do we have examples of that we could actually see?
Um,
One of the
I've
images
got,
that you showed looked like it could have been a little bit on those lines.
yes, I'll just see what I've got here. This is one pollard. Just let me share this screen a sec.
Here's where we have the jingle music again.
Right, is that showing?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and those are
so that's an oak tree. That's an oak tree in Epping Forest, and you can see that the knobbly, bulbous character around the top of this 2 metres is a very strong characteristic of the pollard when it's been done countlessly. And you can see those branches now starting to get quite heavy. That tree's hollow in the middle. And as those branches get heavier and heavier and heavier, they will eventually split and pull apart that tree. So tree management in parklands like that, when we call these lapsed pollards, when that process has lapsed, it's very hard to do, because if you just cut back the trees to where the pollarding shows, the chances are that tree will die. And in Killerton, just over the border in Devon, near Exeter, they had so many lapsed pollards that in the late 80s, they introduced the technique of cutting them all back down again. And the branches that they cut off were so large that about half of the population of trees that they'd managed in this way died. About half survived, and you can go and see those from Killerton. You have to do it quite carefully. It's quite an arboricultural task to do that carefully, a little bit at a time. There is a technique, but it does take time. So, absolutely.
Oh, right. So again, moving through our chat.
Yeah.
Chrissy asks, well, this is, I suppose, it's a bit too soon to say. Do you think your acorn from the Darley oak will get to be an ancient? What are the chances, or what are the circumstances in which it might?
Well, one of the, sorry, have I still got share screen on?
No, you're back to.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
One of the things with ancient trees, why do trees grow to that amazing age? The most likely solution is the land management, the way that the land is managed around them, the way that the tree is protected. That's the most likely. But there is a possibility there's something in the genes of that particular tree that is enabling it to survive for such a longer time, and that's part of the idea behind collecting acorns and seeds from known trees, and even cloning trees. If you're collecting a seed, an acorn, you've got influence from 2 different trees in that reproduction. So you've got 2 sets of genes. But there are techniques now where people are cloning in the laboratory from very, very tiny cuttings from buds on trees in a gel, and getting the tree to sprout in the gel, and then you're getting that single set of genes from that one tree. So no, the jury is out, but people are thinking it's very important to preserve the genes from some of these trees, some of these ancients. Interestingly, there's no other trees like the Darley growing up around in its vicinity. It's having these hundreds and hundreds of acorns coming out, but very, very few survive and actually reproduce new trees. Bear that in mind. So there is a chance. There is a chance.
So whilst there's cloning going on in order to broaden the gene pool, is there also work being done to identify, say, the longevity genes in particular trees?
No, that's far too early. Far too early in the process. It's a relatively new science, and I think that we will never know unless we actually see the results over a
And
long time.
there's not going to be much commercial incentive to identify a longevity gene that may take hundreds
No.
of years to
Well,
show.
there might be. I mean, certainly there are scientists and tree specialists in America that are developing, taking cloning from the coastal redwoods and other ancient trees around the world, with an idea that these are the best tree stock to replant to combat climate change, deforestation. So
That's thinking ahead then.
it is, yeah.
Okay. We've got David asked about the relationship between the term ancient woodland and ancient trees. Is it like a city where you have to have a cathedral to call yourself a city, or is it simply to do with the way that the whole area has been managed?
Well, I'll tell you something. The one area where I'm very unlikely to find an ancient tree is an ancient woodland. It does sound surprising. There is an ancient woodland. It is a recognised term to identify a particular site that is assumed to be older than 400 years. So it's a woodland site that's been wooded for 400 years. So going back to 1600. And in order to be designated as an ancient woodland, you need to provide some evidence. And one of the evidence is mapping. So if you've got some mapping or some written documentation to say woodland was in this position, location, that would be good. The other interesting way is monitoring the flora in the woodland. And certain combinations of flora take an awful long time to accumulate in a certain environment. And so by identifying certain indicator species of plants and flowers in woodlands, you can have a reasonable assumption that a woodland has been established several hundred years in order to accumulate that many. And that basis then, the thing is, in a woodland, an ancient woodland, or any woodland come to it, it's an awful lot of competition for a tree to survive. It's got competition for nutrients and water in the ground. More importantly, it's got competition for light. Light is one of the most important things for photosynthesis. And if you're crowded out with lots of other trees around you, well, I'm afraid you're not going to have a great chance of surviving a long time. So that's another reason why trees tend not to survive as long. But there's an exception to that. All woodlands were managed by people, for people. Woodlands were not just kept for their aesthetic appeal or beauty going back hundreds of years. People wanted to use the timber in woodlands or the acorn mats to feed their pigs or whatever. And they used to manage the trees there. And in Cornwall, that was primarily by coppicing trees. So a bit like pollard, they would cut the tree off at the base and it would grow new shoots and grow lots of new shoots to a certain size. And they would come back again in about 15 years or 20 years, depending on the size of the timber they wanted, and cut it off again. So these woodlands that we see, these ancient woodlands, are ones that are we would call semi-natural. They're not the original wildwood that once covered most of the country, but they are semi-natural. They're managed by man for a particular produce through coppicing. And a lot of these ancient woodlands actually had ditches and banks surrounding them to protect them from animals coming in and eating all the new shoots, which would destroy all of the work that people have done. So ancient woodland is different from ancient tree, but some of these coppices in the ancient woodland could be incredibly old, but you wouldn't necessarily know by looking, because the actual tree trunks that are growing out of the ground might be quite small, quite fresh. They might be 50 years old or something like that. But the roots underneath have been sat there several centuries, being cut back and doing this. They could be incredibly old, but it's a relatively new science getting to know how old coppices are. But did you know the oldest known coppice in this country is at Westernburt Arboretum, and there is a small leaved lime coppice that has been carbon dated to be around 2,000 years old. So this started off as one single sapling, and it's been cut and grown and spread and spread and spread to this huge area. But all of these different sprouts and trees are actually connected underground and have the same DNA. So it's fascinating.
And what does that say about what was happening in that area in terms of population and agriculture and so on?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. I'm going to hop over for a moment to question a couple of questions we have about what current protection there is for ancient trees. But whilst we're still on the subject of pollarding, is there a minimum age at which you can start pollarding an oak? Do they have to reach a certain age before it's safe to start buggering them about?
Well, you could follow that. There's absolutely no reason. There's no minimum age, but it wouldn't have any purpose. So you would, pollarding is normally a process for growing new shoots out of the reach of animals. But as a technique, pollarding and shaping of the tree could be done at any age. And if you think about the bonsai is precisely that, manipulating a tree to do certain things through cutting and trimming and so on. But the trees that were young trees being pollarded at Trellisig were probably about 20 years old. So they can and should be done if you're trying to create a good pollard very early in life.
And are there some trees that take pollarding better than others? With limes, it's a common architectural, almost a decorative feature, but Caroline here suggests that beech pollards well.
Yeah, beech does. Hornbeam pollards really well. There's not so many hornbeams in Cornwall, but that's quite a special one. Oak trees do. I haven't seen many lime pollards. I don't really know why, but certainly beech, oak, hornbeam, ash trees pollard really well. Ash can be coppiced and pollarded. So any of those sorts of trees, and I would imagine that any tree could be pollarded to a certain effect.
We've got a whole string of questions around how the history of pollarding and how the history of tree management has come up. So I'll try and bring them together. But whilst we're on the subject, there's a bit of a thread here. And do you have any views on yews, the nature, the way they've been managed?
Yeah, yews are absolutely fascinating. The oldest tree in the UK is a yew, and that's a site called Fortingwall. It's a churchyard, and I've got somewhere I've got a picture of that I can show you. Right, I just wonder if I can. Are you able to see that?
Yep, yeah, we see it fine.
Yeah, is that a full screen picture?
That's two images on the same screen.
Yeah, that's great. So that's the oldest tree in the UK, Fortingall Yew in Scotland. is again 2 fragments of what was a monstrous tree. Those little posts in the upper picture are indicating the size of that tree from historical record, and the fragments are there, what's left. They built the enclosure, the wall around the tree. Amazing. But if we look at some of these pictures here, bottom left is as it is now, top left is about 1902. The bottom right is the oldest image of it, and that was about 1780. And there were written records about the tree, the Portingal knew. They wrote about the tree being a single tree. And then we've got pictures of it, and the top right picture is about 1825. So we can see how that tree has evolved over that time, and there is evidence that it was one tree, which is absolutely amazing. In terms of age, this is very difficult to age, but a reasonable assumption is that it is between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. It is almost certainly not 5,000 years old, which a lot of popularist stuff talks about. There has been a lot more recent technical research on aging of yews, and I think that there is a reasonable guess that that is about 2.5 or something. It's very hard to date because the core of the tree, if you were counting the rings, is obviously missing. But nobody, to my knowledge, has done carbon dating on parts of the tree. But which bit do you carbon date? If you carbon date the actual remaining bit of the tree, that's an outside bit. That's a very recent bit. You'd have to get into the root system, I get, to find, and then you'd have to have evidence that that bit of the root system that you carbon date was from the core, was from the earliest part of it. It's immensely difficult to do this scientifically. But the yew tree is, I'm really sad to say, we don't actually have proper ancient yew in Cornwall. And I've been looking for a long time. I'm sure other people have out there, love they, and so on. The spread of ancient yew trees across the country is not even. And there's a swathe from the southeast through the Midlands into Wales that's very, very densely populated with ancient yew trees. But they thin out coming down the peninsula. There are ancient yews in Devon, massive ancient yews that are 1,500 to 2,000 years old, but very, very few, even veteran yews in Cornwall, and certainly no ancient ones that I've yet found. So, but for a yew tree to be identified as ancient, it has to be 800 years old or thereabouts. Remember, I said 400 for an oak tree. It's something like 150 for a birch tree. Different trees grow to different ages. The yew is the one that grows the oldest in the UK. So there are very few of them. They tend to be in churchyards and graveyards. There is obviously sort of rural myths, if you like, that they predated Christianity and potentially signified special sites, special sacred sites, which Christianity then took over as the new religion took over the old Celtic religions. So, there are very few in the wild, but in Cornwall, but they do appear quite a lot, say in the Lake District, in quite wild environments. Hilly mountainous environments, so they do appear out in the wild as well. I could talk all night about yew trees. Call that a day.
We may yet want you to.
Yeah.
I've got more questions coming up about how preservation has happened, and particularly about where we are in the current day. But since a lot of people seem to be interested in pollarding, I have a couple of quick questions here. Caroline says that they repollarded some old beech trees at Toys Hill in Kent in an attempt to prolong their life, at the suggestion of Oliver Rackham himself. Do you
Yeah.
happen to know what the
Nope.
fate of that was?
Don't know about that one particularly, but I know they repollard trees all over the place. I think there's been a period of time from sort of the Second World War where people stopped managing woodlands and trees in the same way. Just before that, forestry, plantations changed the way we looked after our woods and forests and trees, produced trees for industry. And the old traditions of coppicing and pollarding died out. There's a resurgence now. So there are people who are setting up coppicing businesses now around, so even in Cornwall. So I don't know about it, but I know there are many that are trying this repollarding. But the key thing to do that is to do it very gradually over a long period of time. 30, 40 years is the kind of time to try and gradually cut back that tree slowly, so you don't shock the tree too much, you don't kill the tree off.
So that takes us nicely into the next area about the motivations and the cultures almost of preservation. One possible link here. Heather asked, do you need to get permission to pollard a tree? And if so, who from? Or is it simply from the owner of the land?
If the tree is protected, like it has a tree preservation order imposed on it, you need permission. You have to notify the local planning authority about that. If it's in a conservation area, you have to do the same thing, basically. There are protected sites, SSSIs, sites of special scientific interest, which are designated sites which may have populations of veteran trees, and in order to get permission to do a programme of works on there, you may have to do that. But elsewhere, basically, no. Out on the farmland, even out in gardens, street trees that are not protected by a TPO. And this is a big question. It's not just about pollards, it's about ancient and veteran trees. We don't have appropriate protection in this country for them. And we're constantly debating and campaigning to try and get protection. We just had a bit of a boost with extra protection through planning. And the National Planning Policy Framework has better protection for ancient and veteran trees and for ancient woodlands. And that's not just protecting the trees themselves, but it's also the land around them. So it's creating buffer zones to protect that root system. But that only applies if somebody makes an application for planning. So there's a lot of preemptive work that goes on. People who know they want to apply for planning sometimes cut down trees or remove trees before they put the planning application in, when there are no controls. So there are so many loopholes that we're trying to get stitched up better. And that's where things like the England tree strategy come in, where our campaigning through the consultation that's going on could campaign there for better protection.
Well, that's a perfect link to, I was going to try and cover more of the history of preservation and the English cultural interest in parklands and how that may differ from what we find in continental Europe.
Yeah.
But sooner or later we had to get to the point of the government's tree strategy and the consultation that ends in September. So any observations on that, either in terms of what you yourself or your group are putting in, or what support you could get from people like us?
Yeah, well, it's a completely open. You can respond to it as an individual or as an organisation. It does ask you straight away at who are you responding on behalf of. The Ancient Tree Forum will definitely be making a response to this, as will a consortium of organisations, including the Tree Council, and the Ancient Tree Forum follow that up as the actual strategies put together. So the document that is out is not a strategy. It's a statement, lots of statements about what we're doing now, what might be nice to do in the future, and then it has lots of questions, and it asks, which do you think are the most important answers? So it's talking about protection and TPOs, for instance. TPOs are completely inappropriate at the moment for protecting ancient and veteran trees, except where they're in residential areas. TPOs are all about amenity, and amenity means somebody's got to experience that amenity, which means usually a resident, somebody living in that location. So trees out in the countryside, on hedgerows, in parks, big estates, and so on, the local authority would be very reluctant to impose tree preservation orders on. And so we don't have proper protection for those outside. So some changes to the law around TPOs would definitely enable us to apply TPOs on trees that have cultural interest or biological interest, for instance, individually as single trees. So that would be a really great area. The other things that are being debated are biodiversity net gain, for instance. If you've heard about that, it basically is saying, here's a way out if you want to cut down loads of veteran trees or an ancient wood. What you have to do is plant enough trees to compensate for that loss, so that at the end of the day, the net gain, there is a net gain in biodiversity. And the way that they calculate that is about numbers of trees or acres planted and things like that. You remember what Oliver Rackham said, that a single 400-year-old tree is more value than 10,000 200-year-old trees. That is not taken account properly in this calculation, in this metric for biodiversity net gain. So it is a loophole that can be quite badly applied as an excuse for losing quite a lot of environment. And bearing in mind ancient woodland, the value is not just in the trees above the ground, it's in the soil, it's in the roots, it's in the mycorrhiza, it's in the flora under the ground. That is where the value is. And that, you cannot replace that just by replacing 10,000 new saplings. So that's an area. Tree planting is another big challenge because everybody is now into tree planting, climate change, and you can understand the reason, and you can understand when you look at the coverage or tree cover that we've got in this country to other European countries, and when you look back at the history of this country, how it's decreased. But it has decreased throughout history, but it is now increasing again quite significantly. I think we've got something like, in England, 10% tree cover, and in Cornwall we have about 9 or 10% tree cover. In the UK, bringing on board the other countries in the UK, increases to about 13%. But the average cover in Europe of trees is about 38% average. It goes up as high as something like 72% tree cover in Finland, for instance, as the top one. So we're very, very low, well below, one of the lowest ever compared to Europe in terms of tree cover. That doesn't sit quite right, because I just told you we've got more diameter ancient trees in this country than any rest of Europe put together. Interesting, what's going on? So this tree planting initiative is really important, and will make an impact on climate change for sure. But one of the big issues is there's no account of biodiversity properly in this equation. And it's started out as an equation of numbers of trees, numbers of hectares planted. If you have an ancient tree in the middle of a wood pasture that has this incredible biodiversity value, like a ponnock or something like that, but then you plant thousands of new trees all around them, you're going to basically create a long lingering death for those ancient veteran trees and all of the species that they support, as the newer, more vigorous trees outcompete them for light and nutrients. So where you plant trees in relation to things that already have fabulous value is really critical. And open space is not a negative thing. Light and openness is vitally important to produce the right kind of biodiversity in the grasslands, in the heathlands, in the wood pastures of Cornwall and the rest of the country. So the tree strategy needs to grapple with that, and it doesn't yet. So that's another thing. Lots of little things there.
So on the one hand, you would like to see strengthening of tree protection orders, particularly around future development. You'd like to see a much more sophisticated metric on biodiversity. But what about other organisations, I mean, quite apart from the ecological side, things like the National Trust and English Heritage? Are they also lobbying for these trees as being a crucial, irreplaceable heritage?
I would hope so, completely. And all those major organisations are massive landowners and responsible for the management of thousands of hectares of parkland, pasture and estates. So they have to take that very seriously. Practices in the National Trust have changed tremendously. Going back 50 years, a lot of the National Trust estates, they would have, for instance, considered the aesthetics to be quite important and cleared away dead trees and fallen trees and hollowing and stag's headed trees. But now they're realizing that the value of those for biodiversity culture is really important. So I think the National Trust would be a fabulous lobbyist, as would the Woodland Trust and Tree Council and English Heritage.
And is there any connection at all here between the tree strategy and the heritage and so on? And Michael Gove's ideas that one of the great things about getting out the Common Agricultural Policy is that we can fund things of public value. I mean, if history and ecology are not part of that public value, surely they should. So is there an opportunity there for some lobbying, for some joined up government?
There has to be, because at the moment that they are preparing to run a pilot scheme for ELMS, which is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is a kind of replacement for the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP schemes, where Europe put money into farming, for instance. And the ELM scheme is changing, just looking at the name, environmental land management. So it will be hopefully rewarding better environmental use of the land that is also used for production, agriculture. But in the tree strategy, what we have to do is to highlight the most important elements that the grant structure will then support. So we've got to raise the profile of individual trees on woodlands, not planting too close to trees, about keeping organic zones around trees free of fertilizers and pesticides. You remember the mycorrhizal fungi I talked about that have this symbiotic relationship with the roots. they are killed off by chemicals. And spread of agricultural farming chemicals, wormers and pesticides and so on will also kill off those mycorrhizae very, very quickly. And soon they can be completely taken away from important trees by practices to improve the production farming around them. So there's a whole education process to be going on at the same time. And we're working closely with the Farming and Wildlife Group in the Southwest, for instance, start that process of thinking and talking to farmers about their practices locally. Okay.
We are talking at the moment with the National Farmers Union about having a talk on regenerative agriculture at some point in the autumn, and I note that Caroline comments on regeneratively managed wood pasture with Chris Jones in Laddock. Now, would that be anything connected with the use of beavers for water?
Yes, I think it is, yes.
Because that's another topic that we've really got to tease out at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about rewilding. It is a fantastic subject, and there have been some absolutely amazing projects around the world where people now are starting to think about letting nature take its own course in rather than extensive farming and management, but also about introducing key species back into that environment. And the management of land needs to be understood in that way. It is about animals interacting with that environment. You can't just walk away from a huge woodland site or estate and expect it to be rewilded and be sensible and have great value for people without certain factors actually being clicked into place. That's a great book. It's called Wilding there, and it's about the Knepp estate in Sussex. Isabella Tree is the author, and that's one of the great success stories of rewilding in the UK at the moment. There aren't many. I'm talking to somebody else at Cabilla Manor, who's looking at rewilding the site there. So we're hoping to go in and record trees there before that process starts. They're also introducing the beaver at that site as well. So the beaver is one component and begins to change the land and the amount of water on and the management of water flow and control. So there are lots of factors there. You could take it to its extreme and reintroduce the wolf, but you know, we will see probably pine marten and wildcats maybe a gentle step towards that, but already in Europe, reintroducing or allowing the wolf and the wild to take part in rewilded areas is serious, and that's.
Mm-hmm. And whilst we're also looking at the importance of preserving trees in areas of residential development, where the land management schemes are not going to cut in, we did have a question much earlier on from somebody living in Penryn with concerns about whether housing development would be impacting on their world. You did mention the difficulty with people manipulating the criteria for residential development. Is there anything that can be done about that, either by local people campaigning or at a more national policy and legal level?
Well, definitely through the tree strategy to try and box that gap up in some way.
This is the TPOs then, or?
It's not just the TPOs. It might be another method that is pre-planning in some way. I don't quite know what an answer might be, but there is something to combat that preemptive removal of trees. I know about it. There was an estate near here that allowed me in to record trees about 10 years ago, and then suddenly one day I realised one of the trees had gone. a very, very big, very old oak tree. And then lo and behold, they put a planning. I won't say what that is, but it does happen. And so that area definitely needs some consideration. But the other element is recording trees, using the citizen science, getting out and recording a tree. You might not know whether it's an ancient or a veteran. Don't worry about that, because that's usually done by a verifier. Somebody like me, a volunteer with a bit of additional training or experience, will verify what the species is, whether it's ancient or veteran. We'll check perhaps put a bit more detail on it and so on. So you just got to get it there and mapped. Good if you can get photographs. Brilliant if you can get photographs of that tree. You can do it on a phone, by the way.
I was just going to say, how do we do?
How are you?
If I'm wandering in what looked to me like ancient woodland and I spot something that I think looks interesting, how do I find out whether it's already known to you, and B, let you know about it if it doesn't seem to be on your records? How do we get involved with this?
Well, the inventory, just Google that, and you will get on. You'll
Tim,
find your way.
I'm sorry, you froze at that crucial moment. Could you say that again?
The ancient tree inventory. Okay, just look that up on Google. You'll get into the website. You then register on their website, and then it has your information, your name to put on the records. Okay, and then you enter the details. You can enter the location of the tree. If you have a phone, and you can get a signal, you can do this on the phone through the internet website, Ancient Tree Inventory. You have to register beforehand, but it will take the GPS signal and work out where your tree is.
So it knows where you are, of course.
Yeah.
That's if you've got the signal.
If you've got the signal. If you haven't got the signal, you can come back to your laptop or desktop, and you can have a look at an aerial map. And well, in fact, have I got a share on at the minute?
No, but you're about to.
There is nothing. I'll just put it on here.
And we can put these links into the final recording, possibly even a more elaborate version of it. So those who are watching and listening, if you want to check this out, come back to our YouTube site at some point, or it usually takes us a few days or so, but we'll have the details of how to do this there.
Yes. So this is the site, and that's a map. This is a map where I live, so it's just showing me what there is around here. So you would go to the top where it would add a tree, and there's nothing showing on the map there because it must have zoomed in quite a lot. Oh, there you go. So I can change that to a satellite view, and it's actually on my house there. So it will work out where you are, whether you're out on site or you come back. But if it's not there, you want the tree, you know, you can zoom around to a bit of the countryside. You can then zoom in, writing, and you might actually be able to see the individual tree or the location where it is. And then you go through a series of nests, asks you what species it is, how big it is, and that kind of stuff. And it does this in grades. So there's a few simple questions, and then it says, do you want to go in a bit more detail? To go in a bit more detail, it might ask you, do you know if there are any fungi growing on it? Are there any epiphytes growing on the tree? Does it have a lot of deadwood? Is it hollow? All these little questions. And they're just tick box questions, occasionally some that you could write in. it does ask you whether it's a tree that is on private land or public. So there are lots of options. What it doesn't want to do is record a tree on somebody's private land without their permission.
Right.
Okay, unless you can see it from a boundary where you can be on public, or maybe a footpath or something like that. So on this map here that you're looking at, the red ones are actually on private land, and the green ones are on public land. So you can actually zoom into these records.
Okay.
So most of the time you can still put private stuff on, but it does like to recognize and show it on the site. So as you click a record, I click that A there, a file, that box comes up, and then if it's got some key basic information, but if I click that box, as it loads up, it should then give me more information about the actual tree.
Mm-hmm.
It's got obviously got a photograph, it's got a map. We know it's 5.10 meter girth at 1.5 height. It's by a bridle path or footpath, blah, blah, blah. And there's more information if you want. It has categories and more technical information. This has got lichen on it, moss, fern, ivy. It's got a fungi, a southern bracket. It has evidence of invertebrates. Oh, and it's recorded by me. So there you go.
Right.
I don't remember that one.
And Tim, does it have to fall within that fairly precise definition of an ancient tree in order for us to be able to put that kind of data or look it up? Or is there a slightly broader categorization for that? I'm thinking of somewhere like the Fox Rose Hill Gardens, say,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I imagine
I know
planted probably 150 or so years or so, but there are some absolutely stunning trees there.
Yeah.
I just love to know what they are.
Well, a lot of trees in the gardens are non-native sometimes, because they're introduced trees, and that was why the gardens were created around this part of Cornwall. They're very famous. So there are not a lot recorded in. The website itself does tell you, it has sections that will say an ancient oak looks like this, and a veteran oak looks like that, a notable oak looks like this. So you can get a sense of what you're looking at, and if you know the species, of course.
And will it include the veterans and the notables on that map, or do you actually have to? Is the bar set quite high?
The bar's set quite high, and in fact, we should be spending a bit more time refining that, especially now it's getting into public inquiries about veteran trees and planning and things like that. So we'll need to tighten up those sorts of thresholds between them. You don't, as a recorder, don't need to say. You don't say whether it's ancient or veteran. Somebody else will come along, a verifier, to make that distinction. You just provide the evidence. What does it look like? Get photographs. What's the dimensions, the girth at 1.5 meters if you can. And there's even guidance to say how to measure a tree. Because sometimes at 1.5 meters, there's a thundering great branch sticking out the side and you can't measure it at that distance. So it tells you how to measure it, where you would then drop down lower.
Okay.
So spend some time.
So we might even want to try and tie up this inventory of ancient trees with something more like the Cornwall Biodiversity Network's mapping of all forms of greenery and insect life in Cornwall. That would be quite an interesting dialogue between.
Well, we are doing that, yeah. We're doing that with Cornwall. The Planning Authority the Cornwall Council has an intranet system where they keep mapping for the use of planning officers, and we're making sure that the layer about ancient trees is included within that. so that they can assess sites when applications come in. But if you want to see it live and up to date, you've got to go to the Woodland Trust ATI, Ancient Tree Inventory site.
I did say right at the start in introducing how the Café site works, we do sometimes have panel discussions. And it sounds to me like it might be really interesting to have 2 or 3 people looking at different ages and different levels even of verbiage. I'm going to start to wind us up, if only because I'm tired. I think that's must be quite a tour de force, Tim. We have one last question from Heather, who says that she's the custodian of a 200-year-old mixed wood. So what types of trees, granted different trees get to be veteran depending on their overall lifespan, what kind of trees you could be looking for in hopes to find veterans or even ancients amongst them?
Well, if the wood is 200 years from scratch, and there wasn't much there before, then there are not going to be a lot of veterans and ancients there. You certainly won't get oaks of 400 years, obviously, unless perhaps there was a tree that the wood encompassed when it was created. And you do find ancient trees on hedgerows. I volunteer with Tregenigi Woodland in Falmouth, and it's not really an old woodland. It's about 40 years old, but within the woodland are some hedgerows that are centuries old, and the older trees are on those hedgerows, and we can still see the banks and the stone sides. So looking for features like that within a woodland, could you find a location where there are some ancient hazels, hollies, perhaps oaks, ash trees on those features. But the newly planted areas, you might be seeing some sizable beech, perhaps if beech were planted in there 200 years. But we wouldn't call a beech a veteran tree or anything a veteran tree unless it had the characteristics of hollowing and habitat. So lots of dead big branches, hollow sides, holes and pockets, fungi growing on them, epiphytes, invertebrates, dead wood.
What about something like a birch then?
So it's not just a question of age. Being veteran is about habitat.
What about something like a?
Then you broke up.
Yeah, you're freezing up again. Are you back with us? No, I'm not sure you are.
No.
Oh well. We could take this as nature's way of telling us that we've had quite a good run for our Tim, hold on before we say just a broad mention for those wanting to know what's coming up next. We will be having a talk on wild Truro later on in the autumn. The talk that would have been a week or so ago, we will reschedule, and that will be talking about rewilding within our own cities, parks and gardens, about what we can do in an urban environment even to rewild and bring wildlife back. This is not the last, granted this is our sort of lockdown Café side period. This is not the last in our series of appreciating wildlife in our towns and cities. Our final talk for July is going to be with Madeline Gura talking about herring gulls and how we might appreciate the herring gull. But that's at the end of July. For now, Tim, that was an extraordinary tour de force, and I'm quite amazed how much work is being done. At this stage in the evening, we have a bit of a tradition of unmuting everybody and asking, quite apart from the comments in the chat, asking for a bit of a sort of round of thanks and a round of applause for a brilliant talk. David, are we all unmuted?
Oh. Thank you, everybody. that's the on this side. Which side? That side is the email of the Cornwall Ancient Tree Forum, part of a national group. And if you want to find out any more or ask any questions, please email there. And if you then want to join the group for any activities or news, just ask that on the email, and I will add you to the mailing list. I need your permission under the Data Protection Act to be put on the mailing list, so you need to specifically say that when you email us. So other than that, there is an Ancient Tree Forum national website, which we can also post some information, a link to, and that is the fount of all knowledge of nature and ancient trees and historic landscapes and invertebrates. There is so much information on there from some amazing people in the Ancient Tree Forum, all different experts in their different fields. So definitely worth half an hour browsing around that site.
Great.
Anyway, thank you.
And we'll have clear links to all those in the final frame of the video that we'll have on our YouTube channel. Right, great. What a fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Tim. And good night, everyone. See you, I hope, next week.